Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dig into something pretty surprising, a take on love, marriage, and freedom from a Christian saint way back in the 4th century. And trust me, it's probably not what you'd expect.
So get this, a Christian saint argued that for widows, getting married again was actually a sign of weakness. You have to wonder, right? Why on earth did he believe staying single was the better, superior choice? Let's dive into this, because it really flips a lot of our modern ideas about second chances and love right on their head.
Okay, to really get where he's coming from, we've got to travel back in time. We're talking about the late Roman Empire. And there's this really famous preacher who's just completely stumped by something he sees people doing all the time.
This was the big question on his mind. He'd hear women talking about the 1,000 evils of marriage. You know, the stress, the pain of childbirth, the constant worrying about the household. And then, if their husband died, what would they do? They'd turn right around and get married again. It was this huge paradox to him. And this guy, John Chrysostom, was determined to figure it out.
And you have to understand, the guy asking this wasn't just some random person. Nope. He was a huge deal, one of the most famous and celebrated figures in the entire ancient church.
So his name was John, but he was such an incredible speaker, just electric, that people gave him a nickname, Chrysostom. It literally means golden-mouthed. I mean, can you imagine being that good at public speaking? He was born in Antioch, lived through this period of just massive change in the Roman Empire, and his sermons, well, they weren't just for the religious elite. They hit home with regular, everyday people.
Okay, so here's his core argument. And to get it, you have to get into the 4th century mindset. They saw things in a kind of spiritual ranking. At the very top, the absolute best, was virginity. Right below that, chaste widowhood, so staying single after your spouse dies. And then, at the bottom of that ladder, was marriage. So for Chrysostom, a second marriage wasn't, a sin or anything, but he thought it said something really fundamental about your character.
And wow, he did not pull his punches. Look at this. He basically says a second marriage is the mark of a weak soul, someone who's all about earthly pleasures and just can't imagine anything bigger or more sublime. Again, not evil, not a sin, but in his eyes, it was a failure of spiritual ambition. It was choosing the easy, comfortable path instead of striving for something greater.
And he didn't just keep it on a spiritual level. He got super practical. He was like, look, getting married again is just messy. It creates a ton of emotional drama in the house. Think about it. The new husband is always going to be compared to the first one. He's basically walking into a home haunted by his predecessor. The servants are sad, they miss their old master. And the kids from the first marriage probably feel like this new guy is trying to erase their dad's memory. It's just a recipe for conflict.
And this wasn't just his personal opinion either. This slide really shows what the general public thought back then. Even Roman law treated second marriages differently. A first marriage? That was a huge party. Flutes, crowns, dancing, the whole shebang. A second marriage? Nope. It was a quiet, stripped-down affair. It was treated like an indulgence, Something that's allowed, but definitely not something you celebrate and praise.
But okay, Chrysostom wasn't just about tearing down the idea of remarrying. He wasn't just being negative. He actually offered an alternative, a different path that he saw as way more honorable and ultimately more fulfilling.
And that path was what he called the true widow. He basically elevated this status to a sacred calling. The whole point wasn't about being alone or lonely. It was about consciously choosing to dedicate your life to spiritual and celestial things. In his view, the widow wasn't replacing her husband with nothing, she was replacing him with a new, more profound partner, God. And remember that spiritual ladder? This put her right up there, second only to virginity.
So you see what he's doing. He is completely reframing what it means to be a widow. It's no longer something to be pitied. It's not a state of loss or social vulnerability. Instead, it becomes this symbol of incredible strength, of honor, and total devotion to Christ. It's a position of spiritual power.
Now, Chrysostom was no fool. He knew that people in his congregation would be listening to this and thinking, yeah, that sounds nice, but what about the real world? He knew there were practical problems with his idea, and he was ready to tackle them one by one.
And here's the biggest one, the question on everyone's mind. Okay, but who's going to manage the estate? Who's going to protect me? I mean, this is the ancient world we're talking about. A woman on her own had to deal with lawsuits, greedy family members, scheming servants. How could she possibly survive financially and socially without a husband? And his answer is, honestly, kind of amazing and surprisingly modern. He basically says, hold on a second. The husband's job is to go out and acquire the goods. Sure.
but the wife's job is to conserve them. She was already the one running the house when he was alive. He's arguing that she already has all the skills, all the competence she needs to manage her own affairs. Okay, so then his critics pull out their trump card. They go to the Bible itself. They're like, hey, John, what about the Apostle Paul? In his letter to Timothy, he pretty much commands young widows to remarry to avoid scandal. Right? It seems like a direct contradiction. How does he get around that?
Chrysostom's reply is really clever. He argues that this wasn't a command for everyone, it was what's called a concession. Think of it like a compromise or a damage control. He's saying Paul knew that for some women, their weakness of will might lead them into a secret, scandalous life. And for Paul, it was way better for them to have an open, respectable second marriage than to live a secret life of licentiousness. So, it was choosing a lesser good to prevent a much greater evil, a practical solution, not a divine command for all.
So, we've talked about theology, we've talked about practicalities, but what's really going on here? Well, underneath all of this is a pretty radical idea, especially for the 4th century. It's all about a woman's freedom. I mean, listen to this. He says a widow who remarries chooses slavery over liberty. Whoa, that is an incredibly strong way to put it. His point is, by getting married again, she's willingly putting herself back under the authority of a new husband, a new master. She's giving up the personal freedom and autonomy she actually gained when her first husband died. So he lays out this very clear choice for a widow. On the one hand, you can remarry. You get a protector, sure, but you also have to submit to a new master and deal with all that social complexity we talked about. Or, 2, you can remain single. You get to keep control of your property, your life, and you can dedicate yourself to this higher spiritual purpose. And as our source material points out, this defense of a woman's right to choose her own path, it feels absolutely modern.
So what's the big takeaway here? For Chrysostom, this was never about just suppressing desire or saying love is bad. Not at all. It was about channeling that energy, that love, that devotion, toward what he saw as a much more profound union, a union with God. It wasn't about finding a replacement husband. It was about finding a higher purpose and a totally different kind of freedom.
So here's the final thought. Chrysostom saw widowhood not as an end, but as a path to spiritual freedom. And that really makes you think, doesn't it? What does true freedom in a relationship, any relationship, actually mean to us today? It's a question from 1700 years ago, and it's still just as relevant. Makes you wonder.